Today's daf is daf Yud Aleph. I just want to review the Mishnah so you can basic, and we're going to start from Yud Amid Beis just to complete something. We learned in the Mishnah is describing the way the Torah, the certain mitzvah, the way certain topics in the Torah appear in three different methods. So, for example, the Mishnah says, Heter Nedarim, Parchim Ba'aver. The idea, the concept of that, if you make a promise, you can go to a chacham and he can untie the promise. He can release you of your neder that you made. And that concept, it's not written in the Torah. It's Parchim Ba'aver. It's like a bird flying in the airspace. It's like a seabird. It can't take a rest. We can't find really a pasuk in the Chumash that says that you go to a rabbi and he could release you of your vow. And the Gemara says there is, okay, but the Mishnah says there isn't. Then that's one sort of mitzvah. Then the Mishnah says Hilchas Shabbos, Chagigahs, V'Me'ilos. So there's certain parts of Hilchas Shabbos, Chagigahs. That's how this gets into our topic over here. The idea that you have to bring a korban chagigah, shalmei chagigah, is not written in the Torah. It's like one little remez. V'Me'ilos. We'll discuss what that is. Harehem kahararim tiluim b'sara. That's like a mountain, a lot of dinim that's just hanging on a hair. Imagine a mountain just in the air, and it's just leaning on a hair. Shehei mikra miut, there's like one pasuk, ba'halachas merubas, and a lot of halachas. Then the Mishnah says hadinim, the idea of bein adam lechavero, civil judgments between man and his fellow man, va'avodas, and the service in the temple, hataharas, becoming pure, hatumas, how to become tamei, va'arayas, what relationships are adulterous. So there, yesh lehem amash yismachol. There's some parts of it. Obviously, it's all written out and it's straightforward, but some halachas of that are not so clear, but you can find psukim that tell you about it. The hein gufei Torah, that's a major portion of the Torah. Okay, we'll discuss all this today. And then we'll start the next parak, which today is a fascinating parak, probably the most fascinating in all of Shas. So we're beginning Daf Yud Amid Beis by Me'ilos. The Mishnah said that Me'ilos is a concept that is a big idea that's hanging on one little hair. It's like a mountain that's leaning on a hair. So what is Me'ilos? Me'ilos means that if you have, let's say you have money of kachim, if you have like money that belongs to the Beis Hamikdash and you spend it, you take that money and you go buy a suit with it. So then the Torah says you have to pay back the temple. Not only you have to pay back the principal, but you have to give 20% more. Plus, you have to bring a very expensive animal for a korban asham. So the Gemara says, why would you call that something that's not a topic that has no psukim in it? Michtav ksivan. It's pretty straightforward in the Torah. It's written exactly what Me'ilah is all about. Amar Rami Bachama. So Rami Bachama said, Lo nitzrucha. The chiddush of the Mishnah is one halacha is not written in the Torah, which is a very strange halacha, and therefore it's kaharin atluim b'sara. We learned in the Mishnah. I gave a shliach money. I made a mistake, and I gave the shliach money that belonged to Hegdish, and I gave it to the shliach and told him, go buy me a suit with it. So hashaliach she'asher shlichus. If he went to the store and bought me a suit, he did what I told him to do. The din is bal habayis mal. The person that sent the shliach, he has to pay the me'ilah. He has to pay Hegdish back, and he has to bring the korban. Lo yasher shlichus. If the guy didn't do the shlichus, then shliach mal. He didn't do exactly what I told him. He bought, let's say, he bought something else with it. He bought food with the money I gave him. Shliach mahal. Then he has to pay the Hegdish back, and he has to bring the korban. So the Gemara says, here's the strange halacha. If he did do the shlichus, my mahal. If he did the shlichus, why is the person that sent him chayiv a korban milah? This one, the shliach did the avera. He went to the store and bought the suit. And so the guy that sent them should be obligated to pay the korban, and he's liable for the me'ilah. But that doesn't make sense. If I send somebody to be Michal Shabbos, he's responsible for himself. So how could it be that when Me'ila, if I send him, I'm a chayiv the karba Me'ila? Hainu, that's what the Mishnah means, kahararim. The idea, this concept within Me'ila is like a mountain, hatluyim basara, that's hanging on a hair. It's not, there's a remez in the Torah that this is that's true, but it's not really clearly written out in this Torah. Amar Rava says, not true. My kushi, why are you so difficult? Dil misha'ani Me'ila. Me'ila is different. It works. The yalfa chet mitruma. There's a special gzeir shava, chet from truma. It says the word chet by Me'ila, and it says the word chet by truma. Ma hasam, just like by truma, shluchai shel adam k'mois. If you send somebody to do an aveira or send something to take truma, it's as if you did it. Your messenger is like yourself. Afkan, so also over here, shluchei shel adam, my messenger of any person is kamoise, like the person himself. Therefore, it's not such a difficult concept. The fact that you would say, since there's a gzeira shava, it's pretty clear and straightforward that by Me'ila, if I send somebody with mom and a hegdish, and I sent him to do a shlichus, if he does the shlichus, I'm liable. So it's not such a difficult thing. It's not a mountain that's hanging on a hair. Ella Amar Rava says, Lo nitzrucha, it's needed, Elikaditanya, like a following brisa. Nisker balabayis. Let's say I sent him, and while he's going, I remembered, I gave him mammon of Hegdish. I gave him money that belongs to Hegdish. The shliach had no idea that it's money. He thinks it's my money I gave him to go to the store and buy a suit. So then, if the shliach, if I said, in my mind, I don't want him to do it, and he does it anyway, shliach mal, the shliach did the aveira, and he has to bring a carbon. See, he has to bring a carbon me'ila if he actually bought the suit. So the Gemara says, and why is it so strange? Shliach Anya, the poor shliach, Micah Ovid, what did he do? He just followed direction. Go to the suit store, department store, buy a suit. He didn't know that I gave him mom and hegdish. Hainu, that's what it means. That means it's a mountain hanging on a hair. Okay. So the Gemara says, Amar Ravashi, it's not so strange. My kushya, it's not a question. Anybody who takes hegdish money and is not aware of hegdish money and spends it on chulin things. If I had my own money, right, and I had hegdish money, I forgot that it's hegdish money, and I went and bought a personal item with it. So then I'm moil in hegdish. So same thing over here. The shliach never knew that he didn't know it's hegdish money. And he spent it on chulin, so he gets the aveira of me'ila. So it's not such a difficult concept. So why is the Mishnah calling that's the mountain that's hanging on a hairbreadth? Ella Omar Rav Ashi says, Loy nitzrucha. The Mishnah is talking about this following case. Now we learned in the Mishnah. If someone takes notal even, he takes a stone belonging to the Beis Hamikdash, or koira, or a roof beam, shel hegdish, hareze loy mal. You didn't do me'ila. Just by taking it into your possession, you didn't change the definition of what it is. You could bring it to your house, but it's still called the stone belonging to Hegdish. It's still called the beam belonging to Hegdish. You didn't do an aveira, but you gave it to your friend who's in the middle of a construction project, and you gifted to him this stone that you stole from the Beis Hamikdash, or the beam. Humal, the person that gave it to his friend, gets the me'ila. The chaveira and his friend who built it into his house, loimal, didn't do any aveira. So migday. The question is migday. Let's see, mishkal shkale. It's being taken from hegdish. Malu chaveira. What's the difference between him and his friend? The fact is, his friend is the one that's building it into his house. So his friend should be chayev the karbe me'ila. So why is he only mechayev the karbe me'ila? The friend is doing a big aveira by taking the hegdish stone belonging to hegdish, or the beam, and building it into his house. Hainu, that's what the Mishnah means. Kahar harim hatluyim basara. That's like a mountain that's hanging on a hair. So the Gemara says, "My kushya, why it's so difficult to understand?" Dilma kedishmuel. Maybe that brisa, that Mishnah is explaining the way Shmuel explained the Mishnah. The Amar Shmuel said, "Hacha." This Mishnah that said, if you take a stone or a beam belonging to a hegdish, that's referring to. We go to Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Begizbar hamasuris loy avne binyan askinim. We're talking about the treasurer of the Beis Hamikdash, and he has the responsibility over the stones, the building stones of the construction material of the Beis Hamikdash. So the Chol Heicha de Mancha, wherever he will put it, Bershusa de Dei Mancha, wherever he puts it, it's in his possession. So even if he would build it into his own home, it still belongs to Hegdish, because the fact that it's in the Gizbar's possessions, it belongs to Hegdish, because the treasurer's domain and Hegdish domain is one of the same, because he is working for Hegdish. Any domain that he has really is like Hegdish's domain. So therefore, the only way he can be moyel is only if he gives it to somebody else. But if he takes it and brings it over to his domain, it still remains in Hegdish's possession. Elo Mesefa, from the part of the Sefer that says like this: Bona b'soich beisoy. If the Gizbar built it into his house, then hareze lemol, he doesn't get a meila ad sheyorder tachteho b'shava pruta, until he stays under that beam of the house, and he stays there the equivalent of a penny's worth of rent. In other words, he stayed there under the house. So the Gemara says, why does he have to stay there under the house? As soon as he built it into his house, he should be chayiv. Michte, let us see, shnuye, he changed it. It was first in his backyard, and now he takes it and puts it in his house. Mali dar, mali loydar. What's the difference if he lived there or he didn't live there? At the end of the day, it's not the same beam. It's a beam now that is built into the house. So you should be chayiv even if you didn't live in the house. So Hainu, that's what it means. Kaharar natluyim basar. It's a mountain that's hanging on a hair. You can't really understand this. So the Gemara says, my kushya, that's not so difficult. Dilma kadarav. Maybe that is talking about a scenario what Rav explained. The Amar Rav has explained that when you built it in your house, it doesn't mean you built it, you were cementing it in. Kagoin shenicha piaruba. You put this beam as a blockage by a skylight. So you didn't really cement it in place. You just have, let's say you have two floors and you have a skylight between one floor and the other floor. You put this beam and you put it there to cover the skylight. So really it's not cemented in, it's not changed. You could technically lift it off and take it off. Darbe. So if you lived under it and benefited from the Hegdish, then you chayiv a karba meila. Loy darbe. But if you didn't live under that beam, lo, you're not chayiv a karba meila. So what the Gemara is, we're holding by the Gemara right now is very simple. We're trying to find a concept in meila that is a difficult concept to understand, and it's kahara tluyim basara. But so far, we brought all the concepts, they're pretty easy to understand. So the Gemara reverts back to the case of the shliach. I gave the shliach money of Hegdish, and I told him, buy me a suit. When he went, I remembered, I gave him Hegdish money. So then, if the shliach went and bought the suit, the shliach is moil. Since I regretted what I was doing, by the time he didn't know about it, and he went and took my money and bought the suit, he's chayiv. You said that's not so difficult. That's what Rava suggested. You found that not to be such a weird case. That's every case where somebody spends money belonging to Hegdish to chulim. So what's the difference in that case that you're saying the shliach, really, he should not be chayiv a karba mila? Every person that actually forgets that he has Hegdish money and spends it on chulin is chayiv a meila. So why is the shliach should be any different? There is a big difference. Hasam, by a regular person who mistook the Hegdish money and spent it, made the yada, he at one time in his life knew the ikizuz of the Hegdish. He had money belonging to Hegdish. So therefore, the reason why he has to pay if he uses that money for chulin purposes, he should have been more careful to know where his Hegdish money is, so not to spend it for chulin purposes. So even by accident, when he spends it on chulin, that's why he's chayiv a karban nosham. Hacha, by the shliach, when he never knew at any point that what he's holding on to is Hegdish's money. I was the one that gave him the money. The balabas gave him the money. So therefore, why should the shliach be obligated to bring a karban milah? And yet there is like a remez in the Torah that the shliach has to bring a karban milah, even though it's totally like an oinus, not his fault. That's what the Mishnah says. Hainu kaharin atluyim basar. That's a case of a big mountain of a din that's hanging on a hairbreadth. In other words, there is a tiny remez in the Torah, a tiny hint in the Torah that the shliach would be chayiv. The Gemara says, "Mikra mu'ut uva halachas merubah." Sometimes you find ideas, inyanim, topics in the Torah that have little psukim, and there's a lot of halachas. Tana, we learned in the Brisa, Negoim, the whole parsha of Negoim, Va'oyalas, the concept of tent, dead mason in a tent. If you read those topics in the Torah, Mikra mu'ut, there's very little psukim, halachas merubas, and there's a lot of halachas there. So the Gemara says, Negoim, Mikra mu'ut, there's very little psukim in the Torah talking about Negoim. Negoim, Mikra merubai. There's a lot of psukim talking about Negoim. The whole parsha Sazria is talking about Negoim. So what's you're telling me? The parsha of Negoim is Emetzora. So is little psukim. Amar Papa Hachikama. This is what the Brisa means to say. Negoim, the topic of Negoim, Mikra Meruba. There's a lot of psukim in the Torah talking about Negoim. But halachas miutas, there's no halachas that's not straightforward in the Torah. If you would read the Torah, you would get the whole parsha of Negoim very clear. That's not a question. Oyalis, the concept of tent and the inyan of dead bodies being mitama tent, Mikra mu'ut. You read the Chumash, you can only get a little pasuk here, halachas merubas, but Chazal in the Mishnayos learned a lot of dinim from those little psukim. Umay nafka mina. What's the difference? Why do I need to know that? Trivia. So the Gemara says, if you have a doubt what the din by the goyim, then just open a chumash. I am bikroi. Open up a chumash, start reading the psukim again, and then you'll know clearly, because it's pretty straightforward, the parsha of Negoim. Says Riyam Mitzorah, you'll find your answer. If you have a doubt in the Sechta oilis, you don't know what's metama ba'oil, what is an oil, then you can't open up the chumash. You'll have to ayin b'masnis, and you'll have to learn the Mishnais. Dinim, the Mishnah said that dinim are also topics that yesh lahem almas lismoichu. There are things that are not so straightforward, but yet there's a good strong remez for a din. So the Gemara says, wait a second, you open up the Chumash, everything about bein odam lachaveroi is pretty straightforward. Michtav ketzivan, they're all written straightforward. What do I need the Mishnayos for? Just read the Chumash. That's not true. There's one halacha that's not straightforward. And if you read the Chumash, you'll come to the wrong conclusion. What's that? The case of Rebbe. A man intended to kill another man, but instead of killing that man, he killed a woman that was standing trying to protect the man. He killed his wife, let's say. His wife was trying to protect her husband, and he killed his wife. So he was focusing killing one person and by accident and killed somebody else. So he's not chayiv misa. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa, Rebbe says, nefesh tachas nefesh. You kill this person that killed somebody. So from the Torah, you would imply that if you kill somebody, no matter what, you die. No, Rebbe says that means mammon. It means you pay the value of the person. You don't get chayiv misa on that. Why? Because you didn't intend to kill that person. You intended to kill somebody else. So Gemara says, maybe the Torah says you have to kill this person exactly because the Torah says nefesh, take his life because he took her life. So the Gemara says, you juxtapose to another topic where it says it above, and there the topic says that you pay money. For example, the topic above says that if you hit a pregnant woman and the fetus dies, the embryo dies, all you have to do is pay the value of the embryo. Okay, certainly, even though you killed, an embryo, you only pay money, the value. So afkam, so also over here, in the next case of the Torah, where you're trying to kill one, and you trying to kill a man, you end up killing his wife, the Torah also means money. You only pay money, you don't pay the life. The Mishnah says avodas. The whole concept of the temple service is not everything is written in the Torah. Not everything is written in the Torah. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Michtav Ksivin, the whole Sefer Vayikra is pretty straightforward of all the karbonos that are written in the Torah. The Torah it's only teaching you dam, the concept that when you slaughter an animal, there's 3 steps. One, after you slaughter the animal, the kohen catches the blood, and then the kohen has to take the blood and walk it over to the mizbeach, and then that's step 2. And step 3, sprinkle it on the mizbeach. The concept of walking the blood from the slaughtering place to the mizbeach is also an avodah. You need a kohen. You can't, a Yisrael can't do it. You can't get a shikingel to do it. It has to be a kohen with the avodah, and he has to have his kavanah that he's doing an avodah for a service. But the Tanya we learned in a brisa, even though the Torah says v'hikrivu, you should bring it close to the mizbeach. That doesn't mean that the Torah is not referring to the catching of the blood. The Torah is not referring to the halachas adam, bringing the blood. It zu kabbalas adam. That word v'hikrivu means you catch the blood. In other words, nowhere in the Torah does it say bringing the blood is a service. But since the Torah talks about catching the blood, and instead of saying catching the blood, the Torah says bring it close to the mizbeach. So we threw a little remez, more than a remez. It's like a hint. The Torah is saying that walking the blood to the mizbeach is also an avodah. It's also a service. The Torah put it in a lashon of walking, even though it refers to collecting the blood, because really the ksiv hikra v'koyin as hakoil mikdar mizbecha v'omamar zu halachas evarim lekeves. The Torah uses the word v'hikriv throughout Chumash to mean walking things over. When the Torah says bring the limbs to the mizbeach, obviously the Torah is not talking about collecting the limbs. It means carrying all the limbs to the mizbeach. So why should I think that after you slaughter the animal, when the Torah says v'hikrivu, it means anything less than bringing it to the mizbeach? But the Torah did not describe anything about collecting the blood. So the Torah says slaughter the animal. The hikrivu means collect the blood first when the animal is slaughtered. Try to catch the blood. So Lememra dailocha loy teipke maklal kabbalah. But the Torah said it in a language that the hikrivu to teach you that halacha is also an avodah, and it's no different than Kabbalah. Why would I think halacha is not an avodah? Because it's very possible to bypass the whole walking over to the mizbeach. Technically, if I would slaughter an animal right by the mizbeach, then there's no walking the blood over to the mizbeach. It's right there. So I would have thought that the walking of the blood to the mizbeach is not an avodah. That's why the Torah says v'hikrivu, even though the Torah means catching the blood, but v'hikrivu could also mean walking the blood, to teach you that walking the blood to the mizbeach is also an avodah, and you need a regular kohen. The Mishnah said taharas. Anything about purifying yourself, getting rid of tumah, is written in the Torah, but there's some parts that you really need Chazal to tell you what it means. So the Gemara says michtav ksivan. Everything about becoming pure is written in the Torah. I don't need Chazal for anything. So the Gemara says you do. Chazal were the one that told you what the measurement of a mikveh is. It's not written straight out in the Torah. The Torah writes, the Tanya, v'rochetz is besor b'mayim. The Torah says when you want to become pure, you have to go into the mikveh. So b'mei mikveh, you have to go in a mikveh. And the Torah says, es kol besora, your entire body. So what does that mean? That means a mikveh has to have the volume to hold the entire body of a standard human being. Mayim shall kol gufa oila behem. You can go into a pool of water that will cover your entire body. That is the shear. Now the Torah doesn't say what that shear is. B'kamahem. So the Chazal gave it a shear. You dig a pool that's amma by amma. That's a foot, 2 feet by 2 feet. Barum shalish amas with the height of 6 amas, which is with 3 amas, which is 6 feet. Basically, amma by an amma with a height of 3 amas. You fill up water in the volume of that. That's called a mikvah. The Chachamim made the calculation, and that says May mikvah. A May mikvah is arboim saw, is 40 saw. So if you learn the Torah, it doesn't tell you that 40 saw is a mikvah. So therefore, you need Chazal to darshan a pasuk to teach you what is a sheer mikvah to bring taharas. So it's written in the Torah, but it has more of a remez in the Torah, but it's not really straightforward. Same idea of Tameas, how to become Tameh. The Mishnah says, Not everything is so straightforward in the Torah about how to become Tameh. So the Gemara says, Michtav Ksiven. It is written in the Torah, very straightforward, how to become Tameh. Lo nitzrucha ella leka'adasha, like mina sheretz. If you touch the dead sheretz, how much of the dead sheretz do you have to touch till you become Tameh? A lentil bean. That's it. The size of a lentil bean of a dead sheretz. Let's say a dead weasel. So the like siva, it doesn't tell you, the Torah doesn't tell you how much of the dead insect, of the dead sheretz you have to touch to become Tameh. The Tanya Torah says, the time you learn to the Brisa, Bohen, you have to touch the dead sheretz. The Torah says, touch it, you become Tameh. Yachal b'kulam. I would think you have to put your hand and touch the entire dead sheretz. Talmud loyme mayhem. You have to touch part of it. Yachal b'miktsasem. I would think that if you touch part of it, you become Tameh. Talmud loyme behem. The Torah says touch all of it. So the Torah seems to contradict itself. First, the Torah says in order to become Tameh, you have to touch the whole thing. And then the Torah says just touch part of it. So that's not so clear in the Torah how to resolve this contradiction. Comes along the Mishnayos and tell you how to resolve it. You have to touch a little bit, which is like the entire thing. The Torah says all you have to touch is a lentil bean's worth of the sheretz. Why? The formation of a snail at its smallest point it is when it's a kadasha type of lentil. So a chaimet, which is one of the shrotzim, when it's like the tiniest embryo, maybe when it's born, a snail, it's like the size of a lentil bean. So it itself, in its entirety, is a lentil bean. So even if it grows bigger, all you have to do is touch a lentil bean of a dead sheretz and you become Tameh. Rabbi Yosef ben Yehuda Omer kiznav halta, like the tail of a lizard, like the tail of a lizard. So again, the tail of a lizard, Rashi says that when you cut it off while the lizard is still around, somehow it has life in it. And therefore, the tail of a lizard, sometimes at its smallest point, can be like also like a dasha, like a lentil bean. So therefore, those things are not specific in the Torah. You need the Chazal to explain you what the Chumash means. Arayas, adulterous relationships, what's permitted, what's not permitted, is some of it is not written in the Torah. So the Gemara says, Michtav Ksivan. Look in the Torah, Parshas Achri Ma'is or Kedoshim, you read straight out what marriages are permitted and what marriages are not permitted. So it's all straightforward. So the Gemara says, Loi nitzrucha, I need Chazal for only this. We go to Amid Beis, Yud Aleph and Beis. Lebitoi ma'anusasai. Your daughter, a person's not, of course, marry his daughter or have relations with his own daughter. But what happens? He raped a lady, so he's not really married to that lady and has a daughter with that lady. Can he? So the Torah doesn't say. The Torah doesn't say is that clearly usher. The Torah only says that if you actually, the Torah is a little funny. The Torah says that the granddaughter from this girl, that means a person raped a girl, a lady, and then had a daughter, and that daughter had a daughter, that's usher. But the Torah doesn't say what about the daughter herself, the first generation. The like siv, it's not written in the Torah. The Amar Rava said, Amali Rabbi Yitzchak Baravdini, Asya, I learned that out, Heina Heina, Gzeirashava Heina Heina, which means Gzeirashava that says, just like you're usher in your own daughter, in a regular daughter that a lady you married and you have a daughter, you're not allowed to have relations with your own daughter. So even if you raped a lady, you can't have relations with that daughter. And Asya Zima Zima, and just like you would get sreifa, by your own daughter. So you would get sreifa by this daughter, this bita manusasa. So it's not written in the Torah, a bita from your daughter from a raped woman. So therefore, it's a Torah. It's not written in the Torah. So the Torah, and because it's a Gzeira Shava, is more of a remez to it. So therefore, it's not straightforward, and that's what the Mishnah is referring to. Then the Mishnah says, Hein Gufei Torah. The last part of all these things that have big ramazim in the Torah, big explanations in Torah, that's the main part of Torah. So the Gemara says, Hani in Hanach Loi. Does the Mishnah mean that the other parts of the Mishnah, like Heter Nadarim, or some of the other things like Me'ila, Chagigah, are not really main parts of Torah, just because the Torah doesn't talk about it so clearly? Ella, Ema, you have to read the Mishnah. Hein, Behein, Gufei Torah. These things that are more spelled out in the Torah and stuff that are not so spelled out in the Torah, just because it's not written in the Torah, Gufei Torah are main parts of Torah because they at any rate they were given halacha l'maisha Sinai, and they're just as important as the Torah itself. Hadran alach hakol chayavim. Now we go to the second parak, which is again one of the most fascinating parakim in all of Shas. We'll learn some of the Agadah this week. That's Hashem. The Mishnah says, talks about a lecture classroom. Ein darshan ba'arayis b'shloisha. You're not allowed to teach the parsha that deals with arayis, talking about the forbidden marriages, if there are only 3 people in the classroom. Ein darshan ba'arayis b'shloisha. The rabbi plus 2 students is not allowed to have a classroom discussing the arayis. V'loy b'maisa bereishis b'shnayim. You can't teach one student. You're the rabbi. You can't teach one student with the Parsha Bereshis, where it talks about the creation of the world. These are esoteric things. The Mishnah, we're going to discuss all this in the Gemara. V'loy b'merkava, the story about Yecheskel with the chariot, discussing the chariot, what goes on in heaven. B'yachid, you're not allowed to even learn it yourself. Elim came unless you're smart and you understand how to read it. So the Gemara is going to start speaking this. If you tell me you can't read it by yourself, then you tell me you could. So it doesn't make sense. We'll discuss this part of the Mishnah slowly in the Gemara. Now the Mishnah says a very interesting thing. If you use your imagination, your mind's eye, and you think about and you picture in your mind the following 4 things, it would have been better if you have not been created. Those three things, if you start working and let your imagination fly, that's terrible. Mala, you try to figure out what's going up on higher than the angels, what's going on in heaven. Mala mata, what's a little bit below the angels. Mala fonim, we're going to learn like Tosfos what happened before the world was created. Mala ochar, what's going to be happening after the world was created, or what's going on way outer space. When you start thinking too deeply about things that are very hard to grasp, you start walking away with an opinion that there is no purpose in life, and that could lead to atheism. So therefore, the Mishnah says, if you start thinking about the following things, it's better if you didn't come into the world. If you don't concern yourself with the honor, you don't spare the honor of your creator, which means, what the Gemara is going to explain this to mean, that if you do an Aveira and you start thinking to yourself, God's not watching. So you don't believe that God is watching your every second, what's going on, what you're doing at every moment. So if you're not concerned about that, then it's better if you didn't come to the world. Because the whole point of the world is to get a connection with your creator, not by thinking about the creator, not by thinking about what's going on in heaven, but by actually doing the mitzvahs, being fair with your fellow man, and being a charitable person. Then you get a connection with your creator. But you can't chase a connection with your creator by thinking very esoteric things. So we're going to discuss that in the Gemara tomorrow. But Amrit Bereisha, you said in the beginning of the Mishnah, V'loy b'merkava b'yachid. I'm not allowed to learn the story of the chariot in heaven. You're not allowed to learn it by yourself. V'hada Amrit, then you say, Elam kein chacham oy chacham evim medatoi. Only if I'm a smart person, I can understand what I'm reading. So what are you telling me? If I can't read it, if a person's reading it, he obviously understands it. So the Gemara says, Hachikama, we learned wrong pshat in the Mishnah. Ein darshan ba'arayis l'shloisha. You can't have 3 students in the class plus the Rebbe. He is the Rebbe, so that you'll have 4 people in the class. You can't learn Parshas Bereshis with 2 people in the classroom. But you can't teach one student anything about the story of the Merkava, Ella, unless you know that student well. Unless that student could figure things out on his own, so that you could teach that student, and you don't have to spell everything out. He could figure things out for himself. So because certain things are ineffable, so you need to have a student that could take things by the hints that the way you teach it, he could figure out what you mean. Now the Gemara gets into this question, and then we'll stop. This is the last topic. Ein darshan ba'arayis b'shloisha. You can't teach the parsha of illicit relationships to 3 students in the class. Why can't they have 3 students in class? Why can't they have a whole shir and teaching Parshas Achrei Mos Kedoshim with more than 3 students in the class? So Gemara first thinks that it's a din in the Torah. My timer, what do you think? The Torah says, Ish el kol b'sei b'sarei. The Torah talks about the arayas, the illicit marriages, and says, Ish, trey. You have to teach it to 2 people. She'er b'sarei means is another body, chad. So the Torah says, it's like a hint in the Torah. When you're discussing the arayas, only have 3 students in the class. That's what the Gemara wants to think, without any reasons. Just don't. The Torah seems to have a stringency that you can't have more than 3 people in the class. Elamayata. So we're going to say, like, anytime the Torah says ish ki yikala l'kov, ish temizarach l'moyach hochanami, would you say that anytime the Torah says ish, when you can't not allowed to curse Hashem, so to speak, and you're not allowed to do avodah zarah, give your children to avodah zarah, you mean I'll learn those halachas with 2 people in the class? You need the word ish to teach you l'rabes es hagoyim. That teaches you that goyim are shemizorim al bikas Hashem. They're not allowed to bless Hashem, which is like a euphemism. They're not allowed to curse Hashem. And that goyim are not allowed to do idol worship like a Jew. So ish teaches you something. So hainami b'boyle, we need the ish by eroyas to teach you goyim are shemizorim al arayis ki Yisrael. That a goy is not allowed to do arayis like a regular Jew. So the ish is not teaching you how your classroom should be shaped when you're teaching the parsha of Arayas. Ella midiksiv, the Torah says, Gemara takes another step. Shmartem es mishmarti. Ushmartem means you should be careful. Trade, 2 people. Mishmarti is 1 person. Chad. Don't do the Arayas. So the Torah seems to imply that when you're teaching about not doing the Arayas, these disgusting, abominable acts, the Torah says only teach it to 3 people. Still, that makes no sense. Elameata diksiv ushmartem es Shabbos. Watch the Shabbos. Ushmartem es matzos. Watch the matzos. Ushmartem es mismeres hakodesh. Watch the truma. Hochanami. Are you going to say all these halachas, all these topics in the Torah? When you're learning Hilchos Shabbos, you can only have 2 people in the class. When you're learning Masechta Pesachim, you only have 2 people in the class. Makes no sense. Ella Omar Ravashi. Ravashi explains the Mishnah, and this is what you have to understand. Of course, I can teach the Arayas to hundreds of people in the class, but there's one topic of Arayas I'm not allowed to teach to people, only to a small group. My ein dorshim be'arayas b'shloisha, ein dorshim b'sisrei arayas. So you're not allowed to darshan and talk about the hidden parts of arayas, the stuff about adultery that's not written in the Torah. So Rashi says that refers to like certain illicit relationships that are not spelled out in the Torah, like bitay ma'anun sasai, or having a relationship with your mother-in-law or your mother-in-law's mother or your mother-in-law's or your father-in-law's mother. That's not written in the Torah. But still, if you look in the Rabbeinu Chananel says you're not allowed to discuss arayas. There's certain parts of arayas that to discuss what's usher. How much of the act do you have to complete to be subject to arayas? So those are very like X-rated subjects, and therefore you're not allowed to have a large class when you're discussing that. You're only allowed to have a small class, only to 3 people in the class. My timer, svarahu. The Gemara says it's a logical reason, because when you have 3 people in the class, when you only have 2 people in the class, Beitrei, when you have 2 people in the class, Kiyasva Kama Rebeu, when they're sitting in front of their teacher, Chad Shakal V'Tarkal Bahade Rabbi. One will discuss the topic with the Rebbe. What do you mean? How much of the act do you have to do? The idach, what's the other student going to do? Matzli Udaine Legamar. He's going to pay attention to this conversation between the rabbi and his student, right? I'm sorry. Gemara. But once you have 3 people in the class, Chad Shakal V'Tar Bahade Rebbe, he'll have one student discussing with the Rebbe. Hanach Trey, the other 2, like every yeshiva class, Shakli Vitari Bahadei Dadi, the remaining 2 are going to have a conversation on to the side by themselves. They're not going to know my Kama Rabbi, they're not going to know what the rabbi just said. They're going to come to give a leniency in arayas. They say, "Oh, I think I heard from my rabbi that this is not the act, and that part is permitted." And therefore, because they're distracted, you have too many people in the class, and you're discussing such a topic. Therefore, they'll come to be a lenient in the Isra of Arayas. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi kol Torah kula nami." Then the entire Torah you have a problem. You have 3 people in the class, and the Rebbe only gives attention to one student. The 2 students that are having a conversation among themselves are going to come to, paskin wrong and bring out a leniency. So the Gemara says, Arayas shani. Adultery is different. Adultery, you're always looking for a leniency. The Amamar, we learned in the Brisa, we learned before, Gazel, theft, ba'arayas, and adultery. Nafshe mechamdasam, your soul has a desire, and you lust to do it. So therefore, you can always look for the leniency. So therefore, we teach these topics very clearly to a very small class, like a chassan class. Ihachi, if so, gezel gezel people. You just told me there are 2 topics that a person lusts for, and one of them is theft. So the Gemara says no. Arayas, by adultery, bein b'fanav, bein shloi b'fanav, nafesh yotzrei. By arayas, adultery, whether you see the person or whether you don't see the person, you want to have this adulterous relationship, you still have a desire. Your yetzer hara is pushing you toward. You have a drive for it. Gezel, theft, b'fanav nafesh yotzrei. In front of the item that you want to steal, then you have a real desire for it. Shloi b'fanav, if it's not in front of you, loy nafesh yotzrei, you don't have a desire for it. So if you don't have a desire for it, so then the class can be bigger. But when it comes to arayas, then the Mishnah says arayas has to be a very small class. Mitzvah Shem, tomorrow we'll discuss difficult topics about.
And for Bereshis, you need 2 students in the Rebbe, correct?
You're not allowed to have 2 students, only one with the Rebbe.
One for Bereshis.
For Parshas Bereshis. That's tomorrow's topic. Why is that so? But again, all these things probably leads to atheism, or you'll walk away with the wrong impression. So that's we'll learn about tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gute Nacht.
Gute Nacht.